The doctors are unsure about Scrappy's recovery, and there is less and less hope. From the time she was a puppy, Scrappy had only ever experienced love. A scruffy little mongrel with a matted hair and a tail that wagged with more enthusiasm than any of us could keep up with. He was a stray. He was the kind of dog who would run through puddles with complete abandon, jump on couches, and snuggle up in the most peculiar of places, and he would always make his family laugh. The breed that he belonged to was not one that anyone would immediately recognize. He had a heart that was pure, and in the small town of Greenridge, he was a treasure to the community. He was a mixed bag of everything because his heart was pure. His eyes were the color of the clearest summer skies, and his fur has patches of white, brown, and black. His fur was also spotted with black. No, that is not the Scrappy that we are familiar with anymore. Wrapped in blankets that smell of antiseptic and desperation, the Scrappy that we know and love today is currently laying at a veterinary clinic that is completely sterile. His tail, which was once full of life, is now immobile and sits next to his small body, which appears to be weak. His eyes, which were once so dynamic, have become lifeless. His antics, which used to enchant everyone who knew him, have long since disappeared. His cherished family, the Hartmans, are standing by his side, their faces showing signs of exhaustion and pallor. The medical professionals are skeptical about Scrappy's ability to recover, and the spark of hope that once powered the Hartman family's optimism is beginning to go away completely. On the other hand, let's go back in time and examine the progression of this upsetting story. On a typical day, things go awry. 1 month ago, on a typical Tuesday, everything started to happen. The sun had slowly risen over the horizon, bathing the Hartman household in a welcoming golden glow as it illuminated the interior. Life was going well for the Hartman family, which consisted of Rachel and Jim Hartman, their 2 children, Ellie and Max, and their parents. At the same time that Jim was sipping his coffee, Rachel was cooking breakfast for the children. The children were getting ready to go to school. As is his custom, Scrappy was lying on the floor of the kitchen, rolling around in his bed and wagging his tail during the entire process. All of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, everything was different. Scrappy ran out of the house through the front door while the rest of the family was preoccupied with their typical morning routine. This wasn't an unusual occurrence. Scratchy was well known for his inquisitive nature and his passion for the great outdoors. On the other hand, things were different this time. He rushed across the yard, past the street, and directly into the path of a car that was approaching from the opposite direction. A terrible thud followed by the screech of tires reverberated through the atmosphere of the peaceful morning air. As soon as Rachel's cry was heard, Jim, Max, and Ellie ran to the location where the incident had occurred. This was a horror for them to witness. In the center of the road, Scrappy was lying lifeless, his once active shape now crumpled and still. He had lost any trace of movement. Despite the fact that the vehicle that had hit him had come to a halt, and the driver was standing there in a state of shock, it was irrelevant. Scrappy was the only thing that counted. It was Rachel who arrived at his location first. Despite the tears that were flowing down her cheeks, she gathered him up in her arms and spoke his name. He was alive, although his breath was shallow. Jim immediately took action and dialed the number for the veterinarian's office, his voice shaking with fear. In a matter of minutes, Scrappy was already in the car and on his way to the medical facility. As soon as they arrived, the veterinarian, Dr. Porter, was already waiting for them. There was a serious expression on his face. Immediately he retreated to the back of the room and started his inspection of Scrappy. The Hartman family was helpless to do anything but wait as they sat in the waiting area, wringing their hands and resting their hands. The diagnosis is as follows. Dr. Porter finally made his return after what seemed like a lifetime, and he brought with him news that was both a relief and a blow. It was determined that Scrappy had suffered internal damage, in addition to many fractures, to his leg. They were concerned about the harm that had been done to his lungs and heart, as well as the fact that his ribs had been smashed. Scrappy was fortunate to be alive, but healing would take a long time, and there was no guarantee of success. It was Dr. Porter who gave them the assurance, "We will do everything we can." Now, however, I won't sugarcoat it. This is going to be completely up in the air. It will be necessary for us to keep him here for the purpose of monitoring, and even if we do that, there is a significant possibility that he will not survive the next several days. Their family was in utter disbelief. The idea that a simple stroll outside could result in such a catastrophe was completely foreign to them. In spite of this, there was still a glimmer of optimism as they watched Scrappy struggle to remain alive over those first few days. For as long as she could remember, Scrappy had been a warrior. His ability to persevere through even the most trying circumstances was remarkable. He was able to make it through the night, and with each passing hour, they found themselves clinging to the hope that he might recover. Initiation of the struggles. Despite the fact that Scrappy's condition gradually improved, his recovery did not proceed as easily as they had planned all along. He had a difficult time regaining the ability to utilize his back legs. Furthermore, the internal injuries were more severe than was previously believed, and the bone fractures that were present in his limbs were not healing as quickly as was anticipated. The cardiac monitor continued to beep often, but the sound it produced was not the reassuring one that they had hoped for. It served as a timely reminder that Scrappy had not yet emerged from the wilderness. The family of Scrappy spent each and every second of their time at the clinic as the days progressed. They watched as he lay motionless in the cage, his eyes occasionally fluttering open to glance at them, and there was a glimmer of recognition in his gaze. However, Scrappy was not his best self. The dog that had always been so full of life was no longer the same joyful creature that he had been. When Rachel came to visit, he scarcely lifted his head, and he stopped wagging his tail when Ellie and Max spoke to him. He was a very quiet and reserved dog. It was as if the spark that was contained within him had diminished, and they were uncertain as to whether or not it would ever come back. It was obvious that something was wrong, despite the fact that Dr. Porter had hoped that Scrappy would start to regain his strength over the course of time. The dog, who had always been so vivacious and full of delight, was finally showing signs of weakness and lethargic behavior. His body was not responding as they had thought it would, despite the fact that the pain meds were doing everything in their power to keep him comfortable. A crucial moment in time. It wasn't until 2 weeks into Scrappy's stay at the clinic that the Hartmans got the news that they had been dreading all along. There was a terrible infection that had developed in Scrappy. The veterinarian was unable to determine the specific cause of the incident. However, it was a consequence of the damage he had sustained. It was not uncommon for severe trauma patients to suffer from infections like this one, but the consequences were nonetheless terrible. While Dr. Porter was delivering the news, his shoulders were heavy. Scrappy's immune system is having a hard time keeping up with the infection which is spreading. We have begun administering antibiotics to him, but it is not yet clear whether or not he will recover. I'm afraid that we are nearing the end of our options. The family was terribly upset. They had previously been over a great deal of something. They had witnessed Scrappy go through a series of surgeries, his body being twisted and mangled as a result of the accident, and now they were being informed that the infection might be too much for him to overcome. Is there anything else that we could possibly do? In a tone that was scarcely audible above a whisper, Rachel inquired. Dr. Porter let out a sigh. We are at a stage where we need to make certain decisions that are not easy to make. We are able to provide him with comfort, but it is possible that he will never return to the dog he was in the past. The optimism that we once possessed is beginning to dwindle. There are devastating options available to the family. The passage of time brought the family to a point where they needed to make a decision. The health of Scrappy deteriorated, and the glimmer of hope that they had been clinging to was becoming increasingly dimmer. It was obvious that their cherished dog had transitioned from being the lively creature they had been accustomed to seeing. He was no longer the same person he had been in the past, and they were unsure whether or not they could bring themselves to continue to watch him suffer. Every day, Max and Ellie had been by Scrappy's side, their expressions a mixture of concern and helplessness as they stood by her side. The connection that Ellie shared with Scrappy was particularly strong and profound. Because she had spent her entire life with him, the idea of parting ways with him was almost too much for her to handle. That being said, even she started to come to the realization that it might not be fair to Scrappy to keep him alive, simply for the purpose of clinging to the idea of what he used to be. It was a night of sleepless nights for Jim and Rachel, as they discussed their choices. They made an effort to cling to the hope that Scrappy would pull through, that the dog who had always defied the odds would somehow be able to survive. However, as time went on, it became increasingly difficult to deny the fact that the situation was actually occurring. Rachel whispered in a low voice throughout the night, "Perhaps it's time we let him go," and her voice broke. It's possible that this is the only option to alleviate his agony. Jim extended his hand and took her hand. "I'm not sure if I am capable of doing that." Both of them felt a great deal of pressure on the decision. But now they were confronted with the sad thought of letting Scrappy leave, despite the fact that they had always promised to provide him with the finest possible life. A road that comes to an end. At the end of the day, the veterinarian was the one who made the decision for them. After consulting with additional physicians and exploring every possible avenue for Scrappy's recovery, Dr. Porter verified what the family had been afraid of all along. His voice was quiet as he said, "We've tried everything. However, Scrappy will not be able to do a healing. Finally, it is time to let him go." Despite the fact that they were overcome with emotion, the Hartmans made the difficult decision to part ways with their cherished dog. The medical facility was getting ready for the surgery, and Rachel, Jim, Max, and Ellie were close by to comfort Scrappy as he passed away in a calm and serene manner, surrounded by the people who loved him. On that particular day, the Hartman family left the clinic feeling grateful for the years they had spent with Scrappy, despite the fact that they were broken. Even though they were aware that they had done everything in their power to take care of him, it did not make the suffering any less unbearable. Even if the hope that had previously filled their hearts was beginning to fade, the love that they had for Scrappy would never go away. Scrappy had passed away.